In a quiet corner of a diner, an old man with a notepad sits alone. Two officers walk in, their eyes sharp and their assumptions sharper. What follows isn't just a clash, it's a lesson about respect, humility, and quiet strength. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey. The Silver Creek Diner sat quietly at the edge of a sleepy intersection in the small town of Briarwood. Its neon sign buzzed faintly in the pale morning light, casting a soft red glow onto the frost-dusted sidewalk. Inside, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and buttered toast wrapped around the early patrons like a familiar embrace. Locals occupied their usual seats, regulars whose orders were second nature to the waitstaff. At a corner table by the window, Walter Hayes, a 72-year-old retired Army veteran, sat with a steaming mug of black coffee and an aged notepad resting before him. His hands, weathered and scarred, held the pen with steady precision. His attire was unassuming, a faded olive jacket, well-worn jeans, and sturdy boots. Walter carried an air of quiet strength, a presence that felt both still and unyielding, like an old tree weathering countless storms. Each morning, Walter wrote reflections, observations, fragmented lines of poetry, whatever occupied his thoughts. It was a ritual, a grounding habit in a world that often felt like it was moving too fast. He sipped his coffee and gazed out the window, watching as the town stirred to life in its slow, predictable rhythm. The sharp jingle of the diner's doorbell broke the quiet hum of conversation. Two police officers stepped inside, their polished boots clapping against the checkered tile floor. Officer Daniel Cross led the way, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Behind him was Officer Eric Lane, younger and wiry, with an expression that wavered between casual amusement and something colder. They ordered their coffee at the counter, but instead of sitting there, they made their way to the booth nearest to Walter. The quiet murmur of the diner seemed to dim slightly as the officer's presence shifted the energy in the room. Daniel's sharp gaze flicked to Walter's notepad, while Eric leaned back in his seat, his smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What's with the notes, old man? Planning something big?" Eric said, his voice light but laced with something pointed. Walter looked up, his calm, steady eyes meeting Eric's. "Just keeping my mind busy." The moment passed, brief but heavy. Walter returned to his notepad, but he could still feel their eyes on him, watching, assessing. The morning had started like any other, but now there was something different in the air, something sharp and unsettled, waiting to break. The Silver Creek Diner, once filled with the gentle clinks of silverware and soft murmurs of conversation, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Walter Hayes remained seated at his corner table, his pen hovering above his notepad as he tried to refocus. His coffee had grown lukewarm, but he made no move to drink it. Across the aisle, Officers Daniel Cross and Eric Lane continued their quiet conversation, though their eyes flicked back to Walter every so often. "You ever notice how some people look like they're trying too hard to disappear?" Eric said with a smirk, his voice just loud enough to carry over to Walter's table. Daniel didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on Walter a moment longer before shifting back to his coffee cup. Walter caught the exchange out of the corner of his eye and set down his pen. His expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle edge of alertness in his posture. Mina, a young waitress with a warm smile and an apron dusted with flour, approached Walter's table cautiously. "Everything okay here, Mr. Hayes? Need a refill?" Walter gave her a small smile, I'm fine. Nina. Thank you. Before Nina could step away, Eric leaned back in his seat and called over to her. Hey, miss. Does this guy sit here every morning? Writing away like he's working on some kind of manifesto? The diner grew quieter. Nina hesitated, her smile faltering slightly. Mr. Hayes comes in most mornings. Yes. He's just writing, nothing wrong with that. Sure, Eric said, his grin widening. Nothing wrong at all. Walter placed his pen on his notepad and looked up, his calm voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. If you gentlemen have a question for me, feel free to ask it directly. Eric's smirk faded slightly, and Daniel shifted in his seat, his stern expression remaining unreadable. For a moment, neither officer spoke, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. Nina stepped back towards the counter, glancing nervously at the other patrons, who were now watching the interaction unfold. A man near the entrance cleared his throat awkwardly, and a couple in the corner exchanged concerned glances. The tension hung in the air, thick and unmoving, as if the diner itself was holding its breath. Walter sat still, his eyes locked on Eric, waiting for whatever was to come next. The Silver Creek diner felt different now. The warmth of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee had been replaced by an uneasy chill. Walter Hayes remained seated at his corner table, his notepad resting under his weathered hand. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. Across from him, Officers Daniel Cross and Eric Lane sat with their coffees, their gazes locked on Walter. So, Mr. Hayes, Eric said, breaking the silence with a voice that dripped with forced politeness. What exactly are you writing about over there? Plans? Maps? A little morning poetry? Walter looked up, his calm eyes meeting Eric's smirk. Just thoughts. Memories. Nothing worth your concern. Officer. Eric leaned back in his seat, his smirk widening. Memories. Huh. Funny how some folks like to play the hero long after their time is up. Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking between Eric and Walter. He hadn't spoken yet, but his silence carried an air of authority. The other patrons of the diner had stopped pretending not to watch. Even Nina, who had retreated behind the counter, glanced nervously in their direction. You served, didn't you? Eric pressed. Army, right? Walter nodded. Yes, I served. You got proof of that? A little card or something? Or are we just supposed to take your word for it? Eric's voice had lost its mockery, replaced by something sharper, colder. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out his VA identification card, placing it carefully on the table. Eric snatched it up, squinting at the worn edges and faded text. He scoffed. This could be fake. You know how many guys try to pass off stuff like this for a free meal or a little sympathy? A quiet murmur passed through the diner. Walter's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. That card is real. Officer. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and firm. Eric. Maybe that's enough. But Eric wasn't done. He tossed the card back onto the table and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think wearing an old jacket and carrying around some beat-up ID makes you special? Makes you untouchable? Walter didn't reply. His stillness spoke louder than any words could. Frustrated by Walter's silence, Eric slammed his hand down on the table. The sharp crack of skin on wood echoed through the diner, making several patrons jump in their seats. Walter's coffee cup rattled, spilling a thin stream of black liquid onto the tabletop. But Walter didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly picked up his cup, wiped the rim with a napkin, and took a slow sip. The act, simple and unyielding, seemed to ignite something in Eric. He stood abruptly, towering over Walter's seated form. "Stand up," Eric demanded. Daniel rose slightly from his seat, his hand hovering near Eric's arm. "Eric, that's enough." But Eric was beyond listening. "I said, stand up." Walter slowly set his coffee cup down and placed his hands on the edge of the table. His voice was steady. "Officer, I have done nothing wrong. I'm sitting here, minding my own business. Whatever it is you're looking for, you won't find it with me." For a brief moment, the two men stared at each other, one standing, seething with misplaced authority, and the other seated, unmoving, unbroken. At that moment, the bell above the diner's door jingled. The sharp sound cut through the standoff as Captain Marcus Grant entered. His presence was immediate, commanding, and unmistakable. He was a man who carried both the respect of his badge and the weight of years in service. The entire diner seemed to exhale as Captain Grant's voice rang out, firm and steady. "What's going on here?" Eric froze, his shoulders stiffening. Daniel took a step back, his face carefully neutral. Captain Grant's sharp eyes scanned the scene, the spilled coffee, the tense posture of Walter Hayes, and the guilty expression on Eric's face. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. "Someone better start explaining," Captain Grant said, his voice low and deliberate. And just like that, the fragile thread holding the diner's atmosphere together seemed ready to snap. The Silver Creek Diner, once humming with quiet conversations and the clinking of cutlery, now felt frozen in time. All eyes were on Captain Marcus Grant as he stood just inside the doorway, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the checkered tile floor. His uniform, neatly pressed and decorated with insignia earned through years of service, carried an unspoken authority. Captain Grant's sharp eyes swept over the scene, the spilled coffee on Walter Hayes' table, Eric Lane looming over the older man, and Daniel Cross standing stiffly nearby. The silence in the room was suffocating. "Officer Lane," Grant said, his voice firm yet calm. "Step back. Now." Eric hesitated, his face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Slowly, he stepped away from Walter's table, shoving his hands into his pockets. Daniel let out a quiet breath, but his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Grant walked forward, his boots tapping against the tile with deliberate precision. He stopped beside Walter's table, glancing down at the scattered coffee and the weathered VA identification card resting near the edge of the notepad. Gently, Grant picked up the card, studying it for a moment before placing it back down with care. "Mr. Hayes," Grant said, his voice softer now, "I'm truly sorry for this." Walter nodded slightly, his expression calm but tired. "No need to apologize, Captain, but I'd appreciate it if your men learned a little respect." Grant's jaw tightened briefly before he turned his gaze back to Eric and Daniel. "Officers, outside. Now." Eric opened his mouth as if to protest, but one sharp look from Grant silenced him. Without another word, both officers turned and walked briskly out of the diner. The bell above the door chimed faintly as it closed behind them. The weight in the diner seemed to lift slightly, though the air was still heavy with unease. Mina, clutching a coffee pot at the counter, exhaled audibly, and a few patrons shifted in their seats. Captain Grant turned back to Walter. "I know this doesn't undo what just happened, but I'll make sure those men face consequences for their behavior. You have my word on that." Walter looked up at the captain, his tired eyes meeting Grant's steady gaze. "I believe you, Captain." Grant nodded once before stepping back. He turned toward the rest of the diner, raising his voice just enough to be heard by everyone. "I apologize to all of you for what just happened here. This is not how we treat people in this town. And it's not how we represent this uniform." A murmur of agreement passed through the patrons. Nina set down the coffee pot and began moving from table to table, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. With one final nod toward Walter, Captain Grant turned and walked out of the diner. The bell above the door chimed once again, and the heavy silence finally began to dissipate. Walter sat back in his seat, his hands resting on his notepad. The confrontation was over, but its weight still lingered in the air. Outside the diner's window, the morning sun had risen a little higher, casting light across the quiet streets of Briarwood. The cold morning air hit Officers Eric Lane and Daniel Cross as they stood outside the Silver Creek Diner. Captain Marcus Grant faced them, his expression a blend of disappointment and controlled anger. His voice was low but sharp, each word cutting through the silence. "What were you two thinking? An Army veteran, a man who's earned more respect than either of you have shown today, and you treated him like a criminal." Eric shifted uncomfortably, his hands still shoved deep into his pockets. Daniel kept his eyes trained on a crack in the pavement, avoiding the captain's gaze. "You wear this badge to serve and protect, not to intimidate and disrespect." Grant continued, "Your actions today have embarrassed this department and dishonored that uniform." The weight of Grant's words hung heavily between them. After a long pause, he spoke again. "You'll both face disciplinary action, and I expect full written apologies delivered to Mr. Hayes personally. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said quietly. Eric hesitated, then muttered, "Yes, sir." Captain Grant's steely gaze lingered on them for a moment longer before he turned and walked back toward his cruiser. The two officers remained frozen in place, their shoulders heavy with shame. Inside the diner, Walter Hayes watched through the window as the scene unfolded. His notepad sat closed beside his empty coffee cup, and his hands rested steadily on the table. Around him, the other patrons began to relax, conversations resuming in cautious murmurs. The weight of the morning's events still lingered, but justice, at least in part, had been served. Walter closed his eyes briefly and let out a slow breath, his quiet dignity intact amid the fading tension of the diner. Inside the Silver Creek Diner, the tension that had hung so heavily began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Walter Hayes sat at his corner table, his weathered notepad still resting beside his empty coffee cup. The confrontation was over, but its weight lingered in the air like the last wisps of smoke after a fire. Nina, the young waitress, approached Walter with a fresh cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Hayes, this one's on the house. And I'm really sorry for what happened." Walter gave her a small nod, his voice calm and reassuring. "Thank you, Nina. It's not your fault." Nearby, other patrons began to stir from their silence. An older man in a flannel shirt stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Hayes." "Sir, I didn't say anything earlier, and I should have. You didn't deserve that. Thank you for your service." A woman holding a toddler chimed in from her booth. "We're lucky to have people like you here. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Walter offered them both a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement. Around the diner, heads turned in his direction, and murmurs of agreement spread across the room. People began approaching his table, some offering quiet words of gratitude, others simply placing a hand on his shoulder in silent solidarity. Mina returned with a plate of warm toast and eggs. "Please, Mr. Hayes, eat something. It's the least we can do." Walter hesitated for a moment before giving her a grateful smile. "All right, Mina. Thank you." At the far end of the diner, the bell above the door jingled again as Captain Marcus Grant re-entered. He removed his hat respectfully as he approached Walter's table. The room quieted slightly once more. "Mr. Hayes," Grant said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine remorse. "I've spoken with my officers. Rest assured, they'll face consequences for their actions. I wanted to come back and offer my apology again, personally." Walter met the captain's gaze and nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate that." Grant extended his hand, and Walter shook it firmly. With that, the captain turned and exited the diner once more, leaving behind an atmosphere that felt lighter, almost cleansed. Walter took a sip of his fresh coffee and looked around the room. The faces of his neighbors, people who had sat silently during the confrontation, now looked back at him with respect and warmth. The morning sun streamed through the diner's window, casting a soft golden glow across Walter's table. For a brief moment, the world felt still, calm, and right again. The brisk morning air greeted Walter Hayes as he stepped out of the Silver Creek diner. The door closed behind him with a faint chime, and the lingering scent of coffee and bacon faded into the chill of the day. In his hand, he held his weathered notepad, and under his arm, the small plaque honoring his military service was tucked securely. The streets of Briarwood were calm, the town slowly coming to life as sunlight spilled across the rooftops. Walter walked with a measured pace, his boots making soft sounds against the pavement. His breath formed faint clouds in the cold air, but his thoughts were far from the chill. The encounter at the diner replayed in his mind, the sharp words, the tension, the unspoken weight of judgment. But what lingered most wasn't the anger or the disrespect, it was the way the community had rallied. The heartfelt words from Mina, the quiet apologies from strangers, and Captain Grant's sincere remorse stood out against the ugliness of the morning. Walter paused briefly at a bench overlooking the town square. He sat down, setting his notepad beside him. The plaque's golden edge caught the sunlight, and for a moment, he simply stared at it. Life had taught him many lessons, but today's encounter reinforced an old truth: dignity isn't something others can take away, it's something you carry within. He let out a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Despite everything, Walter felt no bitterness, only a deep, quiet resolve. He would return to the diner tomorrow, sit at his corner table, and write in his notepad. The world would keep moving, and so would he. With a faint smile, Walter stood, tucked the notepad under his arm, and continued his walk home, his shadow stretching long in the morning light.
This wasn't just Walter's story, it's a reminder for all of us about respect and humility. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in this story with others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.